Well, this is my favorite place on earth to read. It's not hard to see why. I'm going to read you chapter 1, and if I had to say too much about it to you, then we're already doomed, aren't we? Because you're supposed to not need to know anything. But the whole book is written by the redoubtable and complicated Jack McNulty in Accra in 1957, just as Ghana has gained its independence. And I think he's looking for a little bit of that himself. Some way of surviving maybe the vicissitudes of his own life and be an independent man. So he's writing his book to see if he can meet himself in the book. And having equipped himself with that knowledge of himself, maybe go on from there. And that's what he's doing. But he begins the book with a description of the first time he approached the coast of Ghana, which was then, of course, the Gold Coast in the Second World War. He's already got his temporary commission in the British Army because he's a very good engineer. And he's 37, which in army terms used to be called an old man. And so therefore, the consequence of that is the title, the temporary gentleman, because that was the nickname for those guys. Sadly for you, tragically, I'm going to try to sing the epigraph. I think slaughter the epigraph. It's terribly hard to sing. I don't know why I didn't choose some nice ballad, but anyway.
Go.
There we go. When I am laid, I'm laid in earth. May my wrongs create no trouble in thy breast. It's a beautiful night and no mistake. You would never think there was a war somewhere. These less than prophetic words were spoken by a young Navy second lieutenant on the wide, night-bedarkened deck of our supply ship bound for Accra. He was a tubby little man whom the day sun had scorched red. Happy to hear an Irish accent, I asked him where he was from, and he said, with that special enthusiasm Irish people reserve for each other when they accidentally meet abroad, Donegal. We talked then about Bundoran in the summer, where my father had often brought his band. It was a pleasure to shoot the breeze with him for a few moments as the engines growled on deep below. The cargo was 800 men and officers, all headed for various parts of British Africa. There was the noise of the little parliaments of the card players and the impromptu music halls of the whiskey drinkers. And true enough, a lovely mole grey air moved across the ship in a beneficent wave. We could see the coast of Africa lying out along a minutely fidgeting shoreline. The only illuminations were the merry lights of the ship and the sombre philosophical lights of God above. Otherwise, the land ahead was favoured only by darkness, a confident brushstroke of a rich black ink. I had been in an excellent mood for days, having picked the winner of the Middle Park Stakes at Nottingham. Every so often, I stuck a hand in my right pocket and jingled part of my winnings in the shape of a few half-crowns. The rest of it was inserted into an inside pocket of my uniform, a fold of lovely, crisp white banknotes. I'd get up to Nottingham on a brief furlough, having been given a length of time not quite long enough to justify the long trek across England and Ireland to Sligo. France had fallen to Hitler, and suddenly, bizarrely, colonies like the Gold Coast were surrounded by the new enemy, the forces of the Vichy French. No one knew what was going to happen, but we were being shunted down quickly to be in place to blow bridges, burst canals, and break up roads if the need arose. We had heard the colonial regiments were being swelled by new recruits, thousands of Gold Coast men rushing to defend the empire. I suppose this was when Tom Quay, though of course I didn't know him then, joined up. So, I was standing there, flush with my winnings, not thinking of much, as always somewhat intoxicated by being at sea, somewhat in love with an unknown coastline and the intriguing country lying in behind. I had also about a bottle of Scotch whisky in me, though I stood rooted as a tree for all that. It was a moment of simple exhilaration. My red hair, the self-same red hair that had first brought me to the attention of May, for it was not I who said hello to her first, but she, with her playful question in the simple, neat quadrangle of the university. I suppose you put a colour in that. My red hair was brushed flat back from my forehead, my second lieutenant's cap holding it down like a pot lid. My cheeks had been shaved by my Batman Percy Welsh. My underclothes were starched. My trousers were creased. My shoes were signalling back brightly to the moon. When suddenly, the whole port side of the ship seemed to go up, right in front of my eyes. An enormous gush and geyser of water, a shuddering explosion, an ear-numbing rip of metallic noise, and a vast red cornet of flames the size of the torch on the Statue of Liberty. The young second lieutenant from Donegal was suddenly as dead as one of those porpoises you will see washed up on the beach at Enniscrone after a storm. On the deck beside me, felled by a jagged missile of stray metal. Men came tearing up from below, the doorways oozing them out as if so much boiling molasses. There were cries and questions, even as the gigantic fountain of displaced water collapsed and found the deck and hammered us flat there as if we were blobs of dough. Two of my sappers were trying to peel me back up from the deck, itself splintered and crated from the force, and now other stray bits of the ship rained down, clattering and banging and boasting and killing. That was a fucking torpedo, said my sergeant, with perfect redundancy, a little man called Ned Johns from Cornwall, the most knowledgeable man for a fuse I ever worked with. He probably knew the make and poundage of the torpedo, but if he did, he didn't say. The next second, the huge ship started to pitch to port, and before I could grab him, Ned Johns went off sliding down the new slope and smashing into the rail, gathered himself, stood up, looked back at me, and then was wrenched across the rail and out of view. I knew we were hole deep under the waterline. I could more or less feel it in my body. Something vital torn out of the ship echoed in the pit of my stomach. Some mischief done, deep, deep, in some engine room or cargo hold. My other helper, Johnny Fats Talbot, a man so lean you could have used him for spare wire, as poor Ned Johns once said, in truth was using me now as a kind of bollard, but that was no good, because the ship seemed to make a delayed reaction to its wound and shuddered upward, the ship's rail rearing up 10 feet in a bizarre and impossible movement, catching poor Johnny completely off guard, since he had been bracing himself against a force from the other direction, and off he went behind me, pulling the trouser leg off my uniform as he did so, sending my precious half-crowns firing in every direction. So for a moment of odd calm I stood there, one leg bare to the world, my cap still in place inexplicably, myself drenched so thoroughly I felt 100% seawater. An iron ladder full of men from God knows where, maybe even from inside the ship or from the side of the command deck more likely, with about a dozen calling and screaming persons clinging to it like forest monkeys, moved past me as if it were a trolley being wheeled by the demon of this attack, and crossed the ravaged deck and pitched down into the moiling dark sea behind. Everything roared for that moment, the high night of blanketing stars, the great and immaculate silver serving dish of the sea itself, the rended ship, the offended and ruined men, and then, precipitatively, a silence reigned, the shortest reign of any silence in the empires of silence. The whole vista, the far-off coast, the deck, the sea, was as still for a moment as a painting, as if someone had just painted it all in a studio and was gazing at it, contemplating it, reaching out to put a finishing touch on it, of smoke, of fire, of blood, of water. And then I felt the whole ship leave me, sink under my boots so suddenly that there was for that second a gap between me and it, so that wasn't I like an angel, a winged man suspended. Then gravity broke the spell. Gravity ruined the bloody illusion, and I went miserably and roaringly downward with the ship. The deck broke into the waters. It smashed through the sacred waters like a child breaks an ice puddle in a Sligo winter. It made a noise like that, of something solid, something icy breaking. Glass, really, but not glass. Infinitely soft and receiving water. The deeps, the dreaded deeps. The reason why fishermen never learn to swim. Let the waters take us quickly. Let there be no thrashing and hoping and swimming. No, let your limbs go, be calm. Put your trust in God. Pray quick to your Redeemer, and I did. Just like an errant fisherman, and give up my soul to God, and sent my last signal of love flying back across Europe to May and my children, up the night filthy coast of Africa, across the Canaries, across the old boat of England, and the ancient baby shape of Ireland. I sent her my last word of love. I love thee, May, I am sorry. The ocean closed over my head with its iron will, and the fantastical suck of the sinking ship drew me down as if 100 demons were yanking on my legs. Down, down we went, our handsome troop ship made in Belfast. The loose bodies of the already drowned, the myriad papers and plans for war, the tins of sardines we had taken in Algiers, the fabulous materiel, the brand new trucks, the stocks of tires, the 53 horses, the wooden stakes, the planks, the boxes of carefully stored explosives. All down, down to Neptune we went, extinguished in a moment without either glory or cowardice. An action of the gods, of queer physics, that huge metal mass, sucker-punched, beaten, ruined, wrecked, fucked to all hell, as Ned Johns would say. And I felt the water all around as if I were in the body of a physical creature, as if this were its blood, and the scientifically explainable forces at work were its sinews and muscles. And it stopped my mouth and found the secret worm whorls of my ears, and it wanted entry into me, but I had grabbed, stolen, fetched out with an instinctive exuberance, a last great gulp of breath, and I was bearing this down with me, in my chest, around my heart, as my singing response. My ears were now thundering with the thunders of the sea. I thought I could hear the ship itself cry out in a crazy vocabulary of pain, as if a man could learn this lingo somewhere, the tearing death cries of a vessel. All the while, as if standing on the deck, but that was not possible. And then I thought the ship was turning sideways, like a giant in its bed, and I had no choice to go with it. I was like a salmon looking for the seam in a waterfall, where it could grip its way to the gravel beds on grips of mere water. And now I thought I was rushing over the side, away from the deck, accelerated by some unknown force, faster than the ship itself, and I was scraping along metal. I felt long seagrass and barnacles. Surely I could not have, but I thought I did, and just as the ship went right over, or so I imagined it. How could I know? In the deepest dark, the darkest, deepest dark that ever was, an instance of utter blankness, suddenly I felt the very keel of the troop ship, something wide and round and good, the sacred keel, the foundation of the sailor's hope, the guarantor of his sleep between watches, but all up the wrong way, in the wrong place, violently torn from its proper place. And just in that moment, with a great groan, a weird and menacing sighing, a sort of silence as the worst noise in creation, the keel halted. It went back the other way, at the spine of a whale, as if the ship were now fish. And because I was holding onto the keel, riding it like a fly on a saddle, it sort of threw me back up the other way, catapulted me slowly, Mr. Cannonball himself in the twopenny circus of old at Enniscrone. My childhood flaring in my head, my whole life flaring, and then I seemed to be in the shrouds of the little forward mast, and I squeezed my body into a tight ball. Again, pure instinct, not a thought in my head. And as the killed ship rolled slowly over, seeking its doom at least in a poetic and beautiful curve, the furled sails rolled me over and over, giving me strange speed, volition unknown, and I unfolded myself like a lover rising victorious from the marriage bed. And I spread my arms, and I thrust them into the ocean, and swam, looking for the surface, praying for it, gone a mile beyond mere breathlessness, ready to grow gills to survive this. And then it was there, the utterly simple sky, God's bare lights, in the serene harbours of the constellations, and I grabbed like a greedy child onto something, a shard of something, a ruined and precious fragment, and there I floated, gripping on, half mad, for a minute without memory. Oh, May, for a minute all absence and presence, a creature blanked out and destroyed, a creature bizarrely renewed. By the grace of God, we were travelling in convoy that night, and by the grace of God, for some reason only known to its captain and its crouching sailors, the submarine melted off into the deeps, not that any of us saw it. A corvette bristling with machine guns manoeuvred up near me. I heard the confident voices with wild gratitude. Arms reached down into the darkness for me, pulled me from the chaos, and I slumped, suddenly lumpish and exhausted, at the boots of my rescuers, falling down to lie with other survivors, some with dark-blooded wounds, a few entirely naked, clothes sucked off. I lay there, ticking with life, triumphant, terrified. I noticed myself checking my inside pocket for the roll of banknotes, as if watching someone else, as if I were two people, and I laughed at my other self for his foolishness. We steamed into Accra the following morning.
Shock of being back in New York.
I was like a salmon looking for the seam in a waterfall, where it could grip its way to the gravel beds on grips of mere water. You heard phrases like that throughout that piece of writing that might have slipped past you like a fish, but it's packed full of that kind of excitement. Sebastian, will you take a few moments for questions?
I certainly will.
Mr. Barry, is there any movement on a film of a long, long way?
The film world, it's delightful and uncertain terrain. At least with books, they give you a publication date, and more likely than not, they probably will publish it on that date. There have been confident reports in the newspapers about two particular films, one of which the Secret Scripture, and the other a long, long way. But, I mean, I'm not a religious man, but there must be some sort of strange gods attending the arrangements for films, because I don't think I quite understand it. And I could say things to you that would be proven to be graceless but honest lies. I don't know, how do these things come about? So everyone is slaving away to try and make things happen, and sometimes miraculously they do. But I'm always very mindful that every waiter in San Francisco is a screenwriter. I think you should hold that thought in your mind. And that's only San Francisco.
In Our Lady of Sligo, how involved were you with the production, or were you involved at all?
In those days, or in them days, which is how the play began, I can still hear Sinead Cusack's. In them days. Fabulous. Well, this was the wonderful days when we were working with Max and Afra Clark for Out of Joy, and this is the original production. And for some reason, Max prided himself on work. We had done the Stewart of Christendom together, and this was our second play together. And he prided himself on working only with new playwrights, which is a very dangerous and unprofitable thing to be doing. And he liked you to be there every day. And now I would be more questioning of the usefulness of that, because I don't think it's particularly helpful to have the playwright sitting there every day, sometimes looking like this. And Sinead did mention that to me after, but because you're there, but you're already there to accept the changes. You know, brilliant actors like that and Donald, they are testing. They're hitting every line, every phrase with a very special musical testing instrument and making sure it's ringing true. Because as you know, in the theatre, there is nowhere to hide. You've just, everything has to be right. So I was pretending, I think, that I agreed with what they wanted to do, basically. I don't remember ever suggesting cuts or changes. I do remember panicking when they moved a few sentences around, because then suddenly I need a GPS for my own play. I don't know where I am, and I can't answer the question. So as you can see, I was entirely useless to them in the 5 weeks of rehearsal, but I was there. And to see the miraculous thing occurring, which is one of the great pleasures of playwriting. And a compensation for what happens when plays don't go quite to plan, where your own mother will issue an advertisement in the newspaper disowning you. Your closest friend will cross the road to get to the other side, or even leave the country so they never have to meet you again. Formerly loving critics are now having the time of their life telling everyone how absolutely rotten you are, and they were wrong the last time when they were, so all that stuff, You really need a lot of character to be a playwright. And I have found over the 20 years or 30 years trying to be a deficiency of character in myself. So I tell myself, out of kindness to my own living, breathing being, that I've retired from the theatre. I think at 58 you should retire from something. So I thought I would retire from the theatre. So there. Yeah. But when it goes right, there's nothing like it, is there? No.
No, nothing.
No. Sorry.
And it was so right. Lady Sligo was so right.
Jeanette Cusack, thank her wrong. She was playing the same age as the character, but she looked 30 years too young. Very strange. Yeah.
Coming back to the Temporary Gentleman, can you just refresh those of us who have read some of your other books? So it's Jack McNulty is the main character.
Yes.
And he's what's the relationship between Jack and Phineas?
That they're brothers.
They're brothers.
Yes. And he's the brother.
I'm just going to say, the question was about the relationship of Jack McNulty to Aeneas McNulty.
And is Jack the older?
God, is he? I can't remember now. I think it changes in various books. So I can never remember, so I put the handiest thing down. He's also the brother-in-law of Roseanne in The Secret Scripture. And the man whom she marries, Tom, in The Secret Scripture, is Jack's other brother. So, yeah. Enough said.
Sebastian, can I ask you a question about about reading? Do you record your books?
No.
Has your publisher asked
No,
you? No.
audiobooks people are quite separate from the publisher usually, and they very sensibly don't allow me to do that. Because anyway, you'd be taking a job from an actor. I don't believe in doing that. As the son of an actor and the husband of an actor, I'm not going to do that. So yeah. Anyway, I would probably die. You can see that. It was suddenly so hot. I was thinking, I felt like Meatloaf, the pops in when he sweats so much. What's wine? Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I read somewhere, and please correct me if I'm wrong,
Yes.
that your works on the Dunn family, and the Steward of Christendom in particular, was a way to sort of exercise and confront a controversial moment in your heritage, specifically Thomas Dunn being a Catholic supporter of the English crown.
Yeah.
I was wondering if your experience with having written them has been satisfactory or successful in that light.
The question was about whether or not Sebastian's writing on the Dunn family, Annie Dunn and was related to a moment in his own family's history where service to the English crown common enough in Irish history, and whether that was exercised. I don't know how.
Well, the first time I was here, we had just opened the Steward of Christendom, which is about Thomas Dunn, at BAM, and lovely, saintly, brilliant, delightful, cherishable Ben Brantley had raved it in the New York Times. But that was the culmination of a very worried young writer in Ireland before I wrote that play. When I discovered I'd had this ancestor who was one of the last chief superintendents of the Dublin Metropolitan Police before independence, who actually, nobody even knew where he was born. He was so covered over, where he was buried, he was so covered over. I was very worried because I thought, well, now I have a sort of traitor in the family, and will anyone find out? So you might think it's a little bit strange that I sought to hide this fact by writing a play that we later but that was the process. Now, when I started to write about him, because this is one of the troubles of singular histories, and now in Ireland we're writing kind of multiple strand histories. But the singular history of nationalism, which in its own way was very helpful and very life-giving, nevertheless left out a lot and also cancelled out a lot and erased a lot. And maybe at a national level there is a certain argument for that when you're trying to make a new country. But at a familial level, there's never a good consequence of that. So when I started to write the play, the phrase came, H.A. Holman. This was just a man. This was another man who had tried to live a life on this earth. An admirable achievement in itself, as far as I'm concerned. So I wrote the play, and then by extraordinary accident, which is so much part of the theatre I couldn't begin to tell you, Donald McCann, who had been 3 years sober, had worked with Max years before, and Max just sent it to him, and I thought, no, don't do that, that's not going to be. But Donald came and made the great performance of his career in this play. So we ended up having the nicest time of our lives, but the origin of it was fear and dread and dismay on my part. So what that says about what we should be doing with our secrets, I'm not sure. I mean, what I've been doing with secrets, and my mother was the great connoisseur of family secrets, which she would try to reveal at every opportunity, but nevertheless. And there were many secrets. For instance, Jack, the original Jack, let's say the man who lived and breathed, was my grandfather. And a man I worshipped as a child. I had a talent for worship as a child. My two grandfathers I adored. I didn't know my grandmothers. We shared a room in this old mansion in Monkstown that he had bought for £4,000 because it was full of tenants. And eventually we got rid of all the tenants, but nevertheless, at one point we were in a room together, and I was in the bed with him, and he'd be telling me stories about the Hindu Kush and the Northwest frontier. He'd been all over the world, and he'd tell me about Accra and the Gold Coast and people he'd met there and all the things, and he'd fart a bit and he'd say, keep the heat in. And it was the perfect atmosphere for a child. It was the ultimate child. Meanwhile, in another part of the house, during the daytime, my mother would be telling me another set of stories about him, which was all the stuff he would never say. So I had this kind of stereophonic, symphonic flood of information coming at me in the bed and then somewhere else. And she blamed him and prioritized her mother and all the rest of it. I just grew up with this wonderful but frightening sometimes story, a miasma of stories, a tsunami of stories. And the fact that this man in his previous existence, not as a grandfather, had been in the British Army, in the Ireland of that time, in the 70s, when, just after the North conflagrated, was very uncomfortable. And I didn't quite understand why he'd done that. And I didn't understand, and I kind of thought it was foolish, I think, when I was young. It's only now, years later, when you see that, there is a multiplicity of experiences, and that our motives for doing things are often so fictional. We do absolutely living, we create a living narrative of the things we do based on foundations of pure fiction. And his fictional foundation was so wonderful, and he in himself was so wonderful, that it took me like 30 years after he died, 25 years after he died to fully appreciate it. And what I'm saying is that though I might have feared aspects of him and was ashamed of him in some way, now I just think, although there was a lovely review in The Guardian that said, this is the first book that's narrated by the bad guy. Although it was a lovely review, I just remembered, I thought, Jesus, I hope he's not reading The Guardian.
Just on a lighter side, I like.
That was my light side.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, it's not much. It's certainly not very literary, but I do like your technique of assigning the F word to what's his name, Ned Johns. And do you continue that throughout? I just got the book, so do you, and I haven't seen that in any of your other books.
I reserved it. Kept it back. Well, a long, long way. The book about an invented great uncle who went to the First World War has some pretty, soldiers' language. And one or two people complained and said, that's not right, because soldiers would never curse. So I felt I had to actually do that for that, because you're talking about language then.
Yes.
You may find other instances, but that might be the only two. Strangely enough, the use of the word, it's actually a rather lovely question, because as you can imagine, if you're a man in his late 60s and your grandson suddenly starts to write about you, as I did in the 70s, it's a deeply uncomfortable feeling. Let me not allow you to think that he was thrilled. He wasn't in any way thrilled. Now, although he had been a soldier, and a really wonderful soldier, I have to say, he was very successful as a soldier. He ended up as major of the Royal Engineers. He had 2 terms of bomb disposal in England, I was so longing when the Queen came over to Ireland to tell her about this wonderful Irishman who was defusing bombs in England. What a welcome change, man. But she had paid me no heed and moved on to Mary Tennant. What the hell was the question? What was the question?
Your technique of assigning
the
F word
well,
to Ned Jones.
When he took, one of my cousins is here, so I'm worried about saying it. But anyway, I wrote this story, and it was about him and me when I was small, going to see his mother's house in Sligo. Again, people I worship unreservedly. And I described in the story the smell of boiling mutton in the house, which is what was in the house. He took the gravest exception, because he loved his mother, and he felt it like it was a social critique of the household. And he called me around to his flat, appropriately enough, on Appian Way in Dublin, 22 Appian Way if you're ever passing, give him away. And first time in his life, this man, although he'd been a soldier, was a beautiful speaker, beautiful writer, beautiful teller of stories, never used a curse word in my hearing in all the years we were in bed together, you might say. And he said, how do you know these things, you fucker? And I was so offended. I mean, I had no idea what I had done. I'd been in Paris writing these stories. It was nothing to do with anything except the syntax, the force of a story, the thrill of being 22 writing stories in a chambre de bonne. I thought he'd be delighted to see these salmon I brought back from the dark Moy River, my own fish. But no, and that's the only time. And I was so offended. I've said that before, and I've seen it reported sort of backwards, as if we never spoke again until he died, which was 3 or 4 years later, because I was so stupid and so young that I thought everything was forever. I thought he would always be there, and he said at some point, let's make it up, and I refused, which was really dreadful. But by way of recompense, so you mightn't agree if you read The Guardian, I have thought about him, every day of my life, and I revere him as the guardian angel of my childhood, as the man who did that sacred thing. He saw the child enmeshed, embroiled in their own mess of childhood, in their generation, and when he was going west to Sligo, right across the island, he threw the child in the Ford Cortina and brought me with him. This is the task of the grandparent. Let us not forget. Throw the child in the car when you're going west.
One last.
And also my Speaking of family, my brother, Kevin Barry, is sitting down there.
How did you feel?
My brother.
How did you feel if a child of yours decided to write about you? Would you object?
I'm just going to have to be a bit mensch-like about that, haven't I? Because I mean, I have visited, probably met dark nights of the soul on people. It's not people who can sue you that you worry about. It's sitting with the, you know, the little magic lantern of a book that's on your lap. Somebody trustingly reading it and coming across things that fright them. And you just don't want to do that if you can avoid it. And maybe you can't avoid it, but I'm just going to have to, you know, I'm going to have to, what did they say in the army, grow a pair about that.
Will you please join me in thanking Sebastian?
Well, thank you.